Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. Today, I'm going to be taking you through my step-by-step process for this simple watercolor cloudscape. As you can see with this nature scene, I've left everything pretty simple because we're focusing on practicing clouds and painting skies. It's so important that if we're into painting landscapes and nature scenes, that we make time for sky studies and cloud studies. This is a technique that I usually bring in when I want more drama in the sky. Other times, when I want to keep the sky nice and simple and just want to create a subtle hint of clouds in the sky, I simply do some lifting and I paint the sky pretty quickly. All right, without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this tutorial. So to begin, I'm going to be working on a half sheet from this Arches cold press 140-pound watercolor paper pad. This means that the rectangle that you're going to be seeing me work in is approximately 6 inches in height and 9 inches in width. Now, it's totally up to you if you want to work in the same size as what I'm going to be using, or if you want to use the full sheet that whatever watercolor paper pad it is that you're using provides. I will say though, and this is to be completely transparent and honest with you because I want you to know that nobody's perfect and you could be painting with watercolors for years and still not arrive at great results on the first try, okay? So I painted this cloudscape 3 times in total until I arrived at something that I actually liked and wanted to share with you. Okay, so in terms of my paint, I'm going to be using 6 different full pans from my St. Petersburg White Nights paint set. And these colors are cadmium yellow medium, violet, olive green, green, Indian throne blue, and Payne's gray. You by no means have to use these exact colors that I am going to be using. I'm going to be swatching out my color mixtures before getting started with my painting process so that you can see what they look like and you can just replace the colors that I'm using with what you have that's similar if you don't have these colors. I used 5 different paintbrushes for this piece. The first one is my 1-inch flat brush from Royal and Langnickel's Watercolor Zen Line set. I also used a large mop brush from Princeton's Neptune line in size 6. And then I used 3 round brushes. One of them is from Princeton's Snap line in size 12. And my other 2 round brushes that I'm going to be using are sizes 6 and 0. They are the light blue brushes that you're going to be seeing me use, and they are from a watercolor paintbrush set from a brand called Magritte that I got via Amazon some time ago. Aside from these supplies, I have my mixing palette with me. I have my Blue Scott absorbent towel, which I cannot paint with watercolor without. I have a couple of regular paper towels from my kitchen, and paper towels are going to be important for the cloud painting technique that I'm going to be sharing with you today. I have my container with clean water in it, which I'm going to be changing at least a couple of times along the way. Don't worry, I'll let you know when I do. And finally, I also have a couple of scrap pieces of watercolor paper on hand. These are just paintings that didn't turn out that I just cut into kind of strips or long rectangles, or cheaper watercolor paper sheets that I always have on hand when I am painting with watercolor so that I can test out color and transparencies before going into my painting with them. Now, painting clouds is a very intuitive process. You kind of have to make decisions along the way based on how things are looking so that those clouds slowly but surely start taking shape. All right, so with all that out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and start preparing my color mixtures that are gonna get me started with this painting process. You're first going to see me create 3 different colors that I'm going to be using for my sky area. The first color that I'm preparing right there at the top is my Indian throne blue with some water in it. It's just plain Indian throne blue. The second little puddle that I am going to be creating is Indian throne blue plus violet. So I want to create a bluish purple color that I can also add into my sky for a bit of color variation. And then the third color that I'm going to be creating is Indian Throne Blue plus Violet plus a bit of Payne's Gray. I want to make that color mixture a little bit more grayed out, a little bit darker, so that I can have some grayish tones for my clouds. After that, you're going to be seeing me work on my color mixtures for my grass area at the bottom. So essentially, I'm going to be creating a lighter green, a medium green, and a darker green. So my lighter green is created by mixing together my cadmium yellow medium plus my olive green. My medium green is created by mixing together my olive green and my green from my St. Petersburg set. So St. Petersburg just calls this second darker green that I'm going to be using green. And it's a very dark, rich, deep green. You're going to see it in just a bit. It does not have very much blue in it like many watercolor green colors do. Lots of greens that you find with watercolors, they are very cool biased, meaning they have a lot of blue in them like the Viridian green or the emerald green. This particular green from my St. Petersburg set is not very blue biased, but it is very dark and deep and rich. All right, so there we go. There's the lighter green that I created with the olive green and the yellow. The medium green right there at the bottom was created by mixing together my olive green and my green. And the third green that I created right there on the bottom right circular little well is just plain green from my St. Petersburg set. So that dark, deep, rich green that I was just talking about before, it's just that plain green. And the final color that I'm creating for myself is a mixture of this same dark, deep, rich green plus my Indian Throne Blue plus a little bit of Payne's Gray. And this is a color that I'm going to be using for the faraway mountains that I want to make sure to paint with a cool temperature to them because of aerial perspective. The grass areas closer to us as the viewer of the scene, I want to make green and warmer in temperature. And I want to make sure to add a little bit of blue into that green that I use to paint the faraway mountains so that I can really create a believable illusion of depth. Aerial perspective tells us that things that are farther away from us as viewers of a scene, of a landscape, of a cityscape, whatever the case may be, when you are standing in a large, wide open area, things that are farthest away from you are going to be cooler in temperature, lighter in value, and hazier or less defined, less details than the elements that are closer to you. And this has to do with the atmosphere and how we see things in real life. And artists who want to bring in a believable illusion of open space and depth and perspective into their pieces use one or a combination of different points that aerial perspective tells us in order to make their pieces look a little bit more believable. All right, so I am done with all of my initial color mixtures. And right here, I am swatching all of these out for you so that you can see what they look like before getting started with the painting process. The first three colors from left to right, the blue purple or purple that you create, and the grayish color, all of those are going to be used for the sky. And then I have my three greens, the light green, medium green, and darker green, which I'm going to use in the grass areas. And finally, that dark bluish green kind of grayed out color is the color that I'm going to be using to paint in the distant mountains. One last thing I want to say before moving forward is make sure that your color mixtures are nice and juicy. I would say look for something like a 50% paint, 50% water in your color mixtures because you want to make sure that they are not super, super watery to the point that the color that you apply turns out to be very, very pale and transparent, especially not for the techniques that we're going to be using today. Something that I see a lot of beginners struggling with is they are using color mixtures that are incredibly watery and they are not keeping track of how watered down their color is becoming throughout the painting process because What you have to remember is that every single time you dip your paintbrush in your container of water, you're bringing out at least a little bit of water into your color mixtures, and you're watering them down more and more along the process. You want to develop a habit of constantly checking on your color mixtures along the way so that you can make sure that you are either bringing in a little bit more paint into them if they are becoming too watered down, or bring out a little bit more water into them if you need to reactivate that color or get them a little bit more watery because they're too thick, whatever the case may be. But watercolor is an incredibly fluid process, and you're constantly shifting and changing the ratios in your color mixtures along the way, depending on what it is that you're doing, whether it's the paint to water ratio or whether it's the color to color ratio or whatever it is that you're doing in that current point in time. So develop that habit of constantly checking on your color mixtures and making sure that they are where you need them to be for what you are doing in that point in time in your painting process. All right, so after having finished preparing my color mixtures, I changed my water because, as always, when I finish preparing my color mixtures, my water is very murky, and it's very important that it's nice and clean for the pre-wetting that we're going to be doing next. Once I have my clean container of water with me, what I am doing right here is softening and doing some crumpling of one of these kitchen paper towels that I have prepared for myself. So you can see me play around with this paper towel, crumpling it in different ways so that I can make sure that it's ready for me while my paint is still wet. With that first layer that we're going to be developing, we have to go in nice and quick with that paper towel while that paint is still wet so that we can do some lifting to start our clouds. All right, so I have my crumpled paper towel right beside me. I grabbed my 1-inch flat brush, and I'm going to go ahead and get started with my pre-wetting using clean water. I'm going to be pre-wetting the entire sheet of watercolor paper here. I'm going to be using both horizontal strokes as well as vertical strokes. And it's super, super important that you take your time with this. I like going over everything at least, I would say, 3 to 4 times, maybe more. It depends on how warm the room that I am working in is, if I have a fan on, whatever the case may be. These different environmental variables really affect how quickly your paper dries. And it's super, super important that you pre-wet your entire sheet effectively so that no one section dries too fast. Be gentle when you're doing your pre-wetting so that you don't affect the sizing of the paper, but don't be afraid of going over the same spot, let's say 3 to 4 times, so that you can make sure that your paper is effectively pre-wetted, so that also you can make sure that you don't have any puddles anywhere and you arrive at a nice even sheen. Make sure that you see that nice even sheen. You can even turn up your paper against the light coming in through the window so that you can make sure that you see a nice glistening, even glistening all throughout before starting to drop in your color. And something that I like going by is I like making sure that my paper has been evenly, effectively pre-wetted. If I allow 10 seconds to pass and I don't see any section of my paper starting to dry, it probably means I have done enough pre-wetting. If a certain section starts drying in like 3 seconds after having finished my pre-wetting, it probably means I haven't pre-wetted enough. So take your time with it and make sure that you work on doing your pre-wetting effectively. And by starting out with our pre-wetting, we are setting ourselves up for success in 2 different ways. Number 1, because there is already a certain amount of water content on our paper, and watercolor is always going to expand and create these beautiful blurred out wet on wet organic effects. When we place our watercolor paint on wetness, that is going to help us arrive at nice looking gradients between our blues and our purples, and also from our color into more translucent, lighter white paper areas. And so that wetness is going to help us create these effects organically And we're not going to have to be doing too much movement of that color after it's been placed on our paper, which in itself leads to a more fresh look when compared to when we go in and do a lot of moving around and a lot of layering. Usually that ends up looking more overworked. And so, yeah, doing our pre-wetting is going to help us in that aspect. But alongside that, doing that pre-wetting is also going to give us more working time when compared to starting to paint on paper that is completely dry. Because when we paint on paper that is completely dry, that paper starts soaking up that paint or that color immediately when it's placed on the paper. And if you've ever painted on dry paper before, you've probably already noticed that you're left with hard, defined edges around the shapes that you paint in, right? And so when you're trying to develop a wash in a large area like the sky or any large area really, doing your pre-wetting first is really going to help you because your paper is going to dry a lot more slowly because of that pre-wetting that you've done. You can load up your paintbrush with more color and pick up from that edge where you left off. You're not going to be left with hard edges around your shapes that you paint in. You're going to have a little bit more time to drop in more color or to even gently move some color around without being left with hard edges. And that's always super, super helpful. You have more working time. For me, as someone who lives in a very warm, dry environment, this is super, super helpful. But as I said before, doing this pre-wetting and just using wet on wet techniques in general, which wet on wet refers to pretty much any sort of technique in which you drop in color onto wet paper, whether that wetness is created with clean water or whether it's an initial layer of paint that is still wet and you're dropping in more paint into that layer of paint that is still wet. Both of those are wet on wet. But these kinds of wet on wet techniques are essential for painting clouds. All right, so I hope that all of that makes sense. Now it is time to go ahead and get started with our color placement. This would be what I would refer to as our first layer of color that we're going to be developing in our sky area, okay? So after having done my pre-wetting in the entire sheet of paper, after having arrived at that nice even sheen and making sure that there are no puddles anywhere, I loaded up my 1-inch flat brush with plenty of that indent-thrown blue, and I started painting at the top, making my way towards the bottom so that the majority of that indent-thrown blue was left in the upper half and very little to none of that blue is in the bottom, especially not the bottom third. If you start making your way down with that load of indent-thrown blue and you notice that your color is not becoming lighter and lighter and you're already past that halfway point down, just remove the color from your paintbrush bristles by dipping your paintbrush, swiveling it in your container of water, remove the excess water, and then just go over that last section of indent-thrown blue and make your way down, pulling, expanding that same amount of color towards the bottom of your sheet. And that is going to help you create that gradient. You have to make sure that you're keeping an eye on how far down you're expanding that color because you can end up filling the entire sheet with that same vibrancy or intensity of blue. And we want our blue to become lighter and lighter as you make your way down because the color closest to the horizon line is going to be lighter than the color that you have in the upper sections of your sky. Once I had a good amount of indent-thrown blue in my sky, I also added in a little bit of that blue purple or purple in a few sections here and there just very randomly, and I softened that color out just a little bit by going over that color with my 1-inch flat brush just very, very gently. I really didn't have to do much at all because the colors started merging together and creating gradients into each other by themselves because everything was pretty wet, and that was very helpful. Once I was happy with that gradient and a little addition of that violet color in my sky, it was time to grab my crumpled up kitchen paper towel that I had beside me and start doing my lifting for those clouds. So I visualized how many clouds I wanted in my sky. I wanted 2 large clouds, and also the overall shape more or less and the size of my clouds before I started doing my lifting with my kitchen paper towel. Now, because this is a cloudscape, I knew that my clouds would be nice and large because in cloudscapes, the main focal point is the sky. It's not too much in the ground area. So I would be able to practice nice, large, interesting looking clouds. And so with those cloud shapes visualized in my mind, I started going in and doing my lifting with my paper towel. Now, because your paint is hopefully still nice and wet, you're probably going to notice that when you go in and do your lifting initially, the fresh paint around that shape that you lift up is still going to softly bleed into this new section where you've done that lifting, which is going to make that initial lifting out of paint look nice and soft. And this means that you're going to have to go back on top of that area to do even more lifting, but this creates a beautiful variation in which you have sections that look more white than others, so to speak. So you have to do your lifting in portions, in layers, because that wet paint is still moving around that paper. It's bleeding into this new section of white paper that you've just lifted up. The wet paint is still gently moving throughout that paper that has different degrees of dampness. And what's cool as well is that you have a variation throughout your clouds in terms of those edges. As you continue jumping around your sky and doing your lifting, you have some edges of your clouds that look nice and diffused out or soft, and other sections of those edges which look sharper. And this also creates a more believable look to your clouds. So even at this point, if you see what I am doing on screen, you can see how there are certain sections that look very, very light blue and others that look very white, right? And those very white sections are sections in which I went in to do my lifting, my absorbing at least 2 to 3 times, or I press down with a little bit more pressure, and that is going to help that kitchen paper towel absorb up more paint when compared to when I don't press down as hard. So you can do all of these different things to make sure that you're arriving at a nice variation in values throughout those clouds, which is exactly what you want. You want to make sure that you're developing a nice range of values, light blues and purple values in those clouds, pale colors and values in those clouds, so that they actually look realistic. Because remember, we're trying to stay away from flatness. In real life, if you go out and see a cloud, there are different values throughout that cloud. It's not a flat, consistent white all throughout. That is not going to look very believable. And so I continue jumping around the piece, continuing to visualize those clouds and using my kitchen paper towel in different ways. Initially, I pressed down quite lightly, and then because that paint is still very wet, it slightly bleeds into this new area where I've lifted up that paint. But I continue doing my lifting and pressing down with different amounts of pressure, varying the pressure that I exert, so that I can have a nice variation in pale blues and purples all throughout. It's important to think of clouds as being 3D structures that are illuminated by the light that is coming from the sun. Yes, clouds are basically made up of water vapor, and you can essentially move past them like with an airplane and things like that, but they have a 3-dimensional structure to them, and it's important to give thought to that 3D structure and to give them dimension. Usually you're going to see the upper edges of clouds are lighter. They have the highlights because those are the sections of the clouds that are being most illuminated by the sun. And you probably also notice that along the bottom of my clouds, as well as in the lower kind of half of this painting, I also did plenty of streaking sideways, horizontal motions with that paper towel to create the illusion of flatter, more narrow looking clouds closest to the horizon line, and to just make the bottom of those clouds appear flatter when compared to the upper parts. It's also very important to think of the sky in terms of 3D-ness and space and perspective, right? And so the clouds that are closest to the horizon line, which is the farthest away point in the distance to us as the viewer of the scene, should be smaller, more narrow, and even more linear, streaky looking than the clouds higher up in the sky that are closer to us. This is going to help us in and of itself create a better, more believable illusion of open space and depth. It's super, super important that as you're doing all of this, as you're jumping around and doing your lifting, that you keep things super, super irregular and that you don't go in with any sort of pattern or organized, perfect shape or anything like that, because that is not going to look very believable. Clouds have a ton of irregularity and imperfection all throughout them, and that is something that we definitely want to have in mind when we're painting clouds if we want them to look believable. All right, so after having done my initial layer of paint and after having done my lifting up of these clouds using my kitchen paper towel, I allowed everything to dry completely, and if you want to, you can help yourself with a hair dryer to speed up the drying process, but everything has to be 100% completely bone dry before moving on to the next part of the painting process. I also changed my water once again to make sure that I was working with nice and clean water. Now that we've done our initial lifting of these clouds, we're now able to see their shape, we're able to see their location, and this is important for this next phase that we're doing. So using my clean 1-inch flat brush, what I am doing right here is I am doing pre-wetting using clean water on this upper section right above my clouds. And what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be deepening and darkening certain sections along the edges of these clouds, along the upper edges. Why? Because I want these clouds to pop out a little bit more, and I want to add in a little bit more color and value variation in this upper section of the sky. It's really going to help the clouds pop out. So very carefully, I am using my 1-inch flat brush and I am making my way around the edges of the clouds that I basically created when I was doing my lifting with my crumpled up kitchen paper towel. It's very important that you pay attention to those very irregular edges around your clouds that you organically created as you were doing your lifting with your crumpled up paper towel, because you don't want those edges to be overly smooth, because that is also going to lead to an unrealistic looking cloud. Make sure that your edges are very irregular all throughout. And if you're more comfortable using a round brush to do this pre-wetting in order to really work around those irregular edges and pay attention to those edge shapes, you can certainly use a larger round brush. But since we're doing pre-wetting in this large shape, which you might even have a larger shape than I do, because this is a relatively large shape that you're pre-wetting, I would recommend using something that's larger, whether it's a larger flat brush or a larger round brush, but not a smaller brush. Why? Because using a smaller brush when you're doing any type of pre-wetting in a medium to larger area or shape, it can be very, very frustrating because the smaller the paintbrush, the less amount of water / paint it's able to hold in its bristles, and the more dipping into your container of water and bringing out into your paper and dipping into your container of water and bringing out into your paper you're gonna have to do, and it's gonna take you even longer to do effective pre-wetting. So just basically, as a rule of thumb, I use the largest paintbrush that I can get away with. Okay, so after having done my pre-wetting using my larger flat brush, I switched on over to my size 12 round brush, and that's the paintbrush that I use to actually start dropping in my color into these shapes that I have pre-wetted right above my clouds. What I am doing right here is I am starting by dropping in more of my Indian Throne blue. And once I have some Indian Throne blue in there, I also drop in some of my blue plus violet color mixture here and there. And you can see how I'm just adding it into some sections here and there along the upper edge of the cloud. I don't want to drop in color all throughout the upper edge of the cloud, just along some sections. Because if you do that, that is also going to create a sort of, not outline, but a very regular look along the edges. And that is also going to lead to things not looking very natural. So just think of darkening certain sections along certain edges. A little bit goes a long way in really making that cloud pop out. This contrast that I'm creating by darkening certain sections behind the cloud is making the sections that I want to leave whiter as highlights along the top of these clouds. It's going to make them look brighter because of that contrast that I am creating. And once I had placed some more of that Indian Throne blue to intensify and deepen and darken that blue along some sections here and there, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles, and what I am doing here is I am going in with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush, and I am doing some softening along some of the edges of the cloud. So again, my intention with this little bit of lifting that I am doing using the bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge is to soften some of those edges and make others look a little bit more defined. I want that variety. I want some edges to look lost and blurred out, and others to be more defined and have a greater amount of contrast when you are relating the cloud to its background. All right, so I am done with that. I changed my water once again, and what I am doing right now is I went back to using my 1-inch flat brush, and I am doing some pre-wetting, but this time I am not going to be pre-wetting the upper section of those clouds. So essentially, I want to pre-wet everything in the lower section of the clouds and also all throughout until the bottom of my sheet. Though I could certainly leave these clouds the way they are, and these techniques that I've already shared with you would create beautiful looking clouds to add into any landscape painting, I am going to push the dimension in these clouds a little bit more. And to do this, I am going to be once again pre-wetting everything because I want a nice diffused out soft look to the darker grayish shapes that I'm going to be adding in right now into the lower sections of these clouds. After having done my pre-wetting using my 1-inch flat brush and clean water, what I am doing right here is I am using my larger size 6 mop brush from Princeton. And what I did was I loaded up my paintbrush with a good amount of that grayed out blue plus purple color mixture, the one where I added that Payne's gray into, and I am dropping it into the lower portion of those two clouds and also doing some more gentle streaking motions as I make my way down the sky. As you're dropping in this gray, it's very important that you once again visualize where the lower parts of your clouds are. You do not want to place this gray in the upper parts, anywhere in the halfway point or above that, okay? Make sure that you are visualizing where the lower portion of your clouds are. I like dividing my cloud's total height into 4 parts or 3 parts and dropping in my gray maybe where the last third of those 3 parts would start, or somewhere along the 3/4 lower section of that total height is where you want to place that gray, because essentially that gray is the bottom part of the cloud. So remember what I said before, where the upper part of the cloud is the part that is most illuminated by the sun, most reflective of that bright light coming from the sun. And then by developing these grays in the lower belly of the cloud that is away from the sun, where the sun is not directly hitting those sections of the clouds, You are developing more dimension throughout them. You are giving them more of a believable 3D structure. Now, just like with anything that's white that we paint with watercolor, we want to make sure that we are building up that color incrementally, gradually. It's important that we keep the majority of the colors that we develop inside of the clouds pale, translucent, very, very soft, and that we have a good amount of that whiteness and that lightness of that paper shining through. Otherwise, your cloud is going to end up looking gray or another color, and it's important that we have a lot of that white shining through if we want our clouds to look white. Unless, of course, you're painting rain clouds or are painting a sky with very intense colors or a very dramatic sky or something like that. But even in those cases, you have to be very careful and very mindful about where you develop those very dark values in your clouds. They have to make sense with the 3D-ness, the structure of that cloud, and also the values that you develop throughout the cloud. They have to make sense in relation to the light source in the sky, which is of course the sun. So I dropped in that gray very sparingly here and there, and once I felt I had a good amount of color on my paper, I removed the color from my paintbrush bristles. I did some gentle moving around, maybe even some lifting. I took a step back, noticed everything as a whole, and then I made the decision whether I wanted to drop in a little bit more of that gray or a little bit more of that Indian throne blue or even a little bit more of the blue purple here and there while everything was still wet so that I could have nice diffused out edges to the paint that I was dropping in. I also did some gentle, very light streaking in the lower section towards closer to the horizon line to also help me just describe those linear, narrow, thinner clouds in the faraway distance. And because I took time to do that pre-wetting before getting started, everything stayed relatively wet to the point that I could keep dropping in a little bit more paint at a time and continue developing my different values and colors throughout the clouds. And right around here, I can tell that my paper is already starting to arrive at that partially dry, awkward state in which I'm going to stop working because I shouldn't be doing anymore. And the way that I can tell is because you can see how the edges around the shapes that I'm painting in, they're not expanding out. I'm not getting that blurred out, diffused out look. They're staying relatively sharp. I can see that edge. And of course, I allow myself to go back in and do some softening with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush. You can soften out those edges of the shapes that you create on dry paper for sure while that paint is still wet, but you want to do it minimally. The more you go back in and move that paint around while it's drying, the more likely it is that you are going to create textures that you didn't want. And the more we go in and start finicking over the paint that we have laid down, the more likely it is that we're going to overwork our piece and maybe even damage our paper. All right, so it was time to allow that to dry completely. Everything is completely dry by this point, and I want to show you something that I did to fix a little bit of a gray streak that was left behind because since I didn't do pre-wetting all throughout my sheet and I only pre-wetted the kind of 3/4 of my sheet going down with that last step, I was left with a little bit of a gray edge. And this is something that can happen when you pre-wet only a certain section. Even if you drop in a little bit of color, that color can expand into that wetness and reach the edge of that shape or area that you have pre-wetted, and that leads to an edge, right? Because that color expanded all the way across that shape and reached that edge of that pre-wetted shape. I don't know if you can see it right there, but that's what I am softening right now. I am doing very gentle scrubbing with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush. It's very, very important that you don't have any paint in your paintbrush bristles or dirty water in your paintbrush bristles if you want to go in and do gentle scrubbing and lifting to soften mistakes or lift up paint that you don't want to add more dimension into an area that you have perhaps flattened out too much, or whatever the case may be. I also like making sure that I have completely allowed that paper to dry before doing this scrubbing technique, because we have to remember that even though this paper is intended for use with watercolor, it's still paper, and if it's wet, it's more fragile, and it's oftentimes very important to allow that paper to dry and regain its strength before using the scrubbing technique. So just do your gentle scrubbing with your clean and slightly damp paintbrush, and then use your absorbent towel to go in to lift up some of that paint. And I just wanted to make sure to share that tip with you in case that happens to you as well. All right, so I allowed my painting to dry completely once again, and it is now time to get started with painting in the grass as well as the faraway mountains in this cloudscape piece. So what I did was I made sure that I had a fresh container of clean water, and then I used my 1-inch flat brush to pre-wet the entire lower half of my sheet. Now, I do want to say, before explaining the next part of this process, that I did not like the way that my mountains ended up looking when I painted them wet on wet. I just ended up painting them all over again after everything had dried. So if you want to skip over painting the mountains at this point, which is what you just saw me do a moment ago using my size 12 round brush and my blue-green color mixture that I added that bit of Payne's gray into before getting started with the painting process, that's the color that I used there. I ended up allowing everything to dry and repainting them on dry paper later because I didn't like how they looked. And the reason why I didn't like how the mountains looked is because I felt that they were getting lost with the sky. You can't even see them at this point. It's like it's part of the sky. You don't even know that they're mountains. And this is because those values for those bluish greens are very, very light, very translucent, very similar to the values that I wanted for my blues in that section of the sky closest to the horizon line. And so this is why I then decided to go in and paint the mountains darker later on dry paper. So if you want to skip over that part of the painting process and jump straight into painting the grass, which is what I am doing right now, you can just jump on over to painting the grass. Or you can paint them on that pre-wetted paper if you want to, because that'll help you create those nice diffused edges around your mountains, which could certainly help you create an illusion of depth. Or you could just decide to leave out the mountains altogether. It's completely up to you. The main objective for this piece are the clouds and the sky. So these elements, these sections in the lower portion of the painting really are kind of secondary to what's going on in the sky. So you can decide what you prefer to do. So by this point, the entire lower half of my painting is still pretty wet, by the way, because I took time to do that pre-wetting. And what I am doing right here is I am using my size 12 round brush to drop in my different greens that I prepared for this area, starting with the lightest yellow green, and then the medium green, and then I dropped in the darkest green in very irregular ways, in a very loose way. I always like getting started with the lightest color that I've prepared for the section on hand, and I make my way incrementally towards the darker color. This doesn't mean that I cannot go back to the lightest color, but initially I like going through this sequence. The majority of the darkest green shapes, if you will, were placed in the sections closest to the viewer of the scene in the lowest part of this painting. And the majority of the lightest yellow-green areas were developed in the middle of that grass section and closer to the horizon line. Because aerial perspective tells us that the sections closest to the viewer are going to be darker in value. So this is going to help me create that sensation of depth. I did my very best to place my greens confidently on that paper, giving thought to that aerial perspective and to making sure that I'm creating a variety of green hues and values throughout in order to actually give this section of the painting dimension. And then I just allowed that paint to do its own thing and left it be. After doing that, as you can see, I decided to start darkening my mountains using my dark blue-green color mixture, so my mixture of Indian Throne blue with a little bit of green and Payne's gray in it. And my paper was still slightly damp when I was doing this, which meant that some sections started bleeding out or up in ways that I didn't want them to. I kind of liked the mountain on the left, but I didn't like the one on the right very much, and I continued fighting with it, doing lifting, adding more color, doing lifting again, until I just decided to allow that section to dry completely and come back in later to paint it on dry paper. After many years of painting with watercolor, one of the most important things that I've learned is when you make a mistake, most often than not, it's going to be best to just do some lifting while that paint is still wet and then allow that to dry completely, and then just make a mental note to come back to it later to fix it and just switch on to working on something else to come back to it later. Most often than not, if you go crazy and you continue fussing over one same area, you're just going to overwork your paper and damage it, and you cannot take that back. Okay, so I left that be for the time being, and what you're seeing me do right here is I am just very lightly, loosely, minimally creating the illusion of blades of grass. And for this, I am using my size 0 round brush. And I am really using all of my different greens for this. You want to make sure that you take into account the value or lightness to darkness of the greens that you've already developed in that initial layer of grass, and then use a very similar color or at least a very similar value when you are developing the blades of grass on top of those greens. And this is because if you go in with a very dark saturated green to paint in those blades of grass, and you only have developed a very light value underneath, that is going to be very stark, very contrasting, and very distracting for the viewer. So make sure that you're taking your values incrementally, a step at a time. If you have areas with very light green or yellow-green values developed, then make sure that you use your medium green or your lighter green in a slightly more saturated state than what you were using underneath for those blades of grass. Whereas if you're adding blades of grass into darker mid-tone greens or darker green areas that you've developed, then you can go ahead and use your darker green in a slightly more saturated state than what you were using underneath those blades of grass. I would always recommend going in with your color lighter than what you actually need than darker. Always take it incrementally, a step at a time towards darker values so that you can keep things subtle. And then if you want to go darker, then you can go ahead and add in darker blades of grass. And this is why it's so important to have a scrap piece of watercolor paper on hand always, so that you can test out your colors and transparencies before going in, so that you don't accidentally add in marks that are super, super saturated and super stark looking. For me, in my opinion, it looks a lot better if you go in subtly and you don't over describe this grass. I am by no means filling up the entire grass section. I am skipping around, making sure that I am using lighter semi-translucent paint colors, and I am shifting and changing between my different greens as needed depending on the section that I am painting on. And another thing that is super, super important in order for that perspective and that depth to look believable and realistic is remember that the blades of grass closer to you as the viewer of the scene should be larger or taller or longer than the blades of grass that are farther away. You want the blades of grass that you add in farther away as they move off into the distance to be shorter than the ones that you add in closer to us as the viewer of the scene. And I'm really not even adding any at all to the upper portion of that grass area, because usually we're able to see much less detail in the sections far away from us or areas far away from us. You want to make sure that the majority of your blades of grass are slightly subtly curved this way and that way. And if you want to, you can also practice this flicking, upwards flicking technique. I did that before actually painting in the blades of grass. It's helpful to do a practice warm-up on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before jumping in, especially if you're using a very, very small brush or something that is very different from the sizes of the brushes that you have been using so far. Making sure that you can do smooth upwards flicking motions so that the bottom of the blade of grass looks thicker and the uppermost section, the tip of that blade of grass, looks like it's tapered. Okay, so you can see how I didn't really fill up that area. I wasn't trying to over describe that grass, and I kept it subtle, and that for me is enough for this piece. Now, while I was painting in those blades of grass, the mountains completely dried, and now it was time to go in and fix them. So what I am doing right here is I switched on over back to my size 12 round brush, and I am using my dark blue-green color to paint in those mountains once again, this time on paper that is completely dry. And because this time the paper is completely dry, these mountains look very, very different from how they looked before, because the edges of these shapes that I am painting in are very sharp and very defined. Not only this, but because the paper is completely dry and that paint is not diffusing out, you're usually going to be left with color that looks a lot darker when you compare it to dropping in color onto pre-wetted paper. When I was painting in these mountains, I made sure to keep them irregular. I didn't want to make the painting too symmetrical with those mountains, so I made sure that the shapes of these mountains were different, and also the lower edges of the mountains I wanted to keep very irregular because all of that was grass and plants close to the base of the mountain. So make sure that the lower edges have a lot of irregularity to them so that you can portray or describe the texture of that grass far away off in the distance. And also you want those mountains to be different from each other. If you're going to be adding in those mountains, you don't want to make them too similar in shape. All right, you guys, we are in the final stretch of this little cloudscape. And this final step is completely optional. If you want to leave your piece as is, then by all means leave it as is. But because watercolor paint tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet, I just wanted to show you that you can still go in and darken certain sections in your clouds if you want to and you feel like you need to add a little bit more dimension into them. You can certainly still do it. So what I did just a moment ago was I did some pre-wetting in the lower portions, I would say the lower 2/3 of the clouds. I pre-wetted with clean water and my 1-inch flat brush. And you can go down past the clouds. In fact, I would recommend going past the clouds downwards as you're doing your pre-wetting. But make sure that the mountains are completely dry because otherwise you're going to move that paint that is still wet with your brush. And what I am doing right here using my mop brush is I am dropping in more of my blue-purple color mixture in sections of those clouds that I want to make look darker, which again are the lower portions of those clouds for the most part. If there are other sections in these clouds that you want to darken more, you can certainly go in with just your Indian Throne blue or just your purple, but I would make sure that you're dropping in just a little bit of color and maybe even test out that color saturation on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before dropping it in, just to make sure that it is not super dark and saturated. So I dropped in just a little bit of color at a time, and once I felt I had placed enough color, I removed all of the color from my paintbrush bristles and went back in to maybe do gentle moving around here and there very softly if I felt I needed to, and I was all done. Alright you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!